I just learned that this is American Public Health Month, and today is Climate Change Day for the American Public Health Association. I love it. I'm an old, TV fan. Maybe you'll remember this saying. I love it when a plan comes together. So it's with great pleasure and deep honor that I can introduce our keynote speaker, who is a man, a human being of a visionary perspective on developing preparations for catastrophic impacts of natural disasters, addressing the future, living in the future today, while also helping businesses and cities thrive in the shadow of the oncoming change, the thing that cannot be stopped, the thing that we have to find a way to embrace, adapt, mitigate, whatever your action word is. Dr. Michael McDonald is the architect of resilient systems and resilient networks, which, as you can see from your program, is in the business of gathering and sharing data. He coordinates the Florida Disaster Resilience Initiative, a program that I'm very happy to be part of, which provides advice on the forecasting and management of strategic and existential threats in Florida, and working to develop resilient hubs in vulnerable communities across the state. He is here to tell us how we can thrive economically in a blue-green economy. Dr. McDonald.
Thank you, Russell. Great to be here with you. It's an honor to be with leaders in this region. I come in with a bias. I want to make sure that's clear to you, that when I look at Florida, I see a lot of pretty significant challenges that are perhaps hitting us earlier than we would like to see happen. So as leaders, I'm going to be pushing a little bit on you further than just trying to persuade you of something. I'm going to do something that I would call a mimetic farming experiment. And what that means is I'm going to be throwing out catalytic memes, fragments of culture, and get a sense from you as to what is the art of the possible here. Because it's not very important what I say to you, but it's very important what you think about. And that's what I'm interested in. So we'll try to get at that through question and answers. My understanding is that's going to be pushed to Bill Fleming at the end of the day, but also informally over the next 2 days. I really want to talk with you about some of what I'm going to put out, some of which may be somewhat controversial. A century ago, Tampa Bay area had a blue-green economy. Essentially, all of its economy was based upon green terrestrial resources and blue ocean resources. And over the last century, that's begun to change. Roughly 3 centuries ago, we had a sustainable economy here, a blue-green economy, with value chains that allowed for many generations to live with the resources, with very plentiful resources in this area. My understanding is that from archaeological information, there may have been one of the largest indigenous populations in North America. There are some of the largest mittens, meaning the waste from food coming from the sea here. So as we look forward, I want you to contemplate that the future is actually already here. It's just distributed unevenly. That we have communities now that are already suffering from climate change, in some cases very significantly. Puerto Rico sometimes is not looked at as part of the United States, but it is. I spent a fair amount of time in Puerto Rico over the last year and before Hurricane Maria, as well as in the Caribbean. So I'm going to just hit on some of that as we discuss things. But I'm going to talk about climate change and the consequences for Tampa Bay, Tampa Bay's carrying capacity initiative, and just to explain that a little bit, you'll see this in a series of slides. There are some concerns that Tampa Bay already may be in processes that are invisible to us that has created a hyper growth that can only collapse unless we manage it very carefully. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm also going to talk about the resilience initiatives that are taking place here. Some of you know about aspects of those that are already bubbling up that I really want to understand from you. But in addition, we've been developing a Florida Disaster Resilience Initiative, and we are in discussions now here about what needs to happen before this hurricane season. Because as you know, we had a near miss of a Cat 5 with Hurricane Michael. So I'll go into that a little bit more as well. One of the key elements is to discuss, is it possible that Tampa Bay region could develop communities of opportunity that have principles of social equity? Meaning, could we actually build out capabilities before we got hit so that we could absorb potentially millions of people that would be displaced in Florida in one hurricane season, possibly even from one event. So I also then want to talk about what is the potential upsides as now there's a lot of money migrating out of the petrochemical political economy, the petroleum political economy, into it's seeking capital, quality capital investment. And what are we going to do if we in fact have to move on, as it appears science is telling us, from the petroleum political economy? So we'll explore the possibility that Tampa Bay region could be a center for international development of blue-green products and services. One thing I'll touch on, I'm not going to go into it in detail because it's somewhat technical, but what if Tampa Bay had a distributed, collectively intelligent grid, meaning that Tampa Bay was on the forefront of the Internet of Things, where not only do we have a cell phone or a computer connected to the Internet, but when you walk into your house, you have 40 or 50 things that are connected to the Internet, some of which are interacting based upon your behavior now, some of which is based on your behavior over a year's time, and that collectively all of that information begins to shape the nature of the society that we're living in. That sounds like science fiction, perhaps, but again, some of that's already happening within communities today. So we'll go into that just to some extent. And then I think most importantly, could we actually create a blue-green circular economy? Meaning that if we saw South Florida get hit with a devastating Cat 5, and Miami as we know it doesn't really exist for a while, what would happen here if there was all of a sudden $3 billion worth of loss to the Florida economy in one event? Could Tampa Bay actually be anticipating that kind of event here and be able to withstand the economic winds of those kinds of hits and huge numbers of climate migrants and so on. So that's some of what I want to touch base with you about. So climate change is not a hierarchical control system. It's a complex adaptive system, and it doesn't respond well to hierarchical control systems, command and control systems. So as much as government wants to make it look like always everything's going to go back in the box, if you take a look at Puerto Rico and Dominica right now, and you spend any time there beyond San Juan, you can really get a sense that some things are quite awry, and will take a lot to get it back in the box. So as we are going forward into a period where ecosystems and cities are threatened and in conflict with each other, what is Tampa Bay going to do? Is there any way of getting ahead of this? Is there a way of not just following in a reactive fashion, but being proactive? So what do we need to know to understand that we're actually at risk? Last fall, the Florida Disaster Resilience Initiative followed Hurricane Michael, and it looked like it was going to hit Tampa Bay. What does that mean? So we know to some degree what Mexico Beach looks like now, but what's the impact? Now, you probably, is there anyone here who hasn't really understood what the scenario of the Phoenix simulation means for Tampa Bay? Anybody who doesn't really understand that? Okay. So this picture is a picture of a following a Cat 5. Let's just assume that a Cat 5, like a Hurricane Michael, what was predicted potentially of Hurricane Michael hitting Tampa Bay area hit. The impact in these red areas would be devastating, okay? And that's a large portion of the population and businesses and economic structures and infrastructure of what supports life as we know it here. Now, Michael was only a year ago. This is not a future simulation. This is something that is a roll of the dice for Tampa. Now, there is a belief that there's something special about the Tampa Bay area, maybe some kind of electromagnetic force that is going to keep things away from hitting Tampa Bay. Maybe that's so, but probably is not something that we want to count on. So what would it look like? First of all, in the previous discussion, the public doesn't want to believe that they would have to face these kinds of events. That means that actually evacuating 3 million people from this area is going to be extremely difficult. And it's probably going to mean thousands of deaths under this scenario. Now, there's lots of other scenarios that we need to be worried about, but obviously this is just one simulation to give us a sense of what we have to prepare for. So it could be a very difficult evacuation. What do we have in place right now that would enable us to shelter effectively? My sense is that we have to be a lot better than we are, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But a 23-foot surge into St. Pete, 26-foot surge into Tampa, 470,000 houses severely damaged or destroyed, and 10,000 businesses destroyed. Very difficult to put that back together again. So if we had the ability to actually anticipate this, and actually take action on it, it would seem like it'd be better to make the $200 billion worth of investment now and have it actually create a growth economy that is sustainable, rather than having to just try to put the pieces back together again. If you look at how the federal government's been responding to the Puerto Rico event, it's fair to say that the federal government's going to be very slow at best. The state government's going to be very slow at best, if you look at the Panhandle right now. And it would be great if we had the opportunity to actually build communities of opportunity within our region that, if we get hit hard, we actually have the seeds of the future built into it. So we have the ability to shelter people, because a lot of people will not be able to evacuate successfully. And we will have the ability to regenerate what we want of the society after some kind of catastrophic event. But ideally, we're also seeding a blue-green economy that is creating leadership in the world to harvest a $3 trillion pool of investment that is already beginning to flee the petrochemical political economy and the petroleum political economy. So let's just look at a couple of factors that we've got to consider as we're looking at the upside. So this is Tampa's population curve. It's an exponential upward trend, which is great from an economic perspective, except if you actually look at what it might mean if it's above carrying capacity. And there are some strong indicators that the population is already above carrying capacity, which means it'll have to drop. And it will not only have to drop to the degree that it goes above carrying capacity, because as you go above carrying capacity, it actually damages the carrying capacity, the ecosystems and the economic systems, the underpinning of a future economic system, so that you're chasing down the ecosystem, essentially, the degradation of the ecosystem. So what if we had resilience networks in all of our communities that had the capacity to actually monitor all of the mission-critical functions that determine whether our communities are trending toward extreme vulnerability or potentially collapse, or if they're trending toward resilience and sustainability? So a little bit of background and discussion points that I'm hoping to have with you, because again, I see it as more important what your views are than my views on this. So I'm really trying to catalyze that discussion. I want you to think about, what if we had resilience systems throughout Florida, and we've built now a South Florida resilience system, a Central Florida resilience system, a West Florida resilience system, and a Panhandle resilience system. They're now evolving. The West Florida resilience system's been in place for about a year. So it has a long ways to go, but we have the essence of that in place. And I'll try to explain that in enough depth so you get a sense of it, given the limit of time. But we can go over it more informally or later. In addition, I want to let you know a little bit about the Florida Disaster Resilience Initiative, because we are now proposing that over the next 2 months, for example, we would be seeding a couple of the initial pieces of it here, which has to do with the ability to monitor, to survey, aggregate the data, analyze it, and look at what is the current status of the mission-critical functions of our communities, of our resilience capacity zones, down to the block level, okay, the census block level. And so I'm very interested to know, what do you think would compose a Tampa Bay resilience initiative? Now, I'm going to jump for a moment to Dominica, and just give you a sense. This is in the days after the hurricane. I flew in on a helicopter. I made 9 agreements with the Prime Minister to look at a series of things. Key security issues, the issues of food security, master plan for creating a climate resilient society. And it was not good. The 95% of the houses were significantly damaged and destroyed in many cases. The electrical system, 99% of it was gone. And for the Atlantic, it took a year and a quarter for them to receive central electricity again through the grid. But some very interesting things are happening in Dominica. So we put solar lights in all of the shelters. About 40% of the population left the island, which is somewhat like what happened in Puerto Rico. So we had 400 to 500,000 people leave Puerto Rico. What has emerged, though, is very interesting. So we got solar lights in every household in the Kalinago territory, for example, which was the first people of Dominica and the dominant society, indigenous society of the Caribbean. They were killed back to between 300 and 400 people in the genocide following the European entry into the Western Hemisphere. But they are an extremely resilient society. We've now built a Kalinago Institute for global resilience and regeneration. Now, why an indigenous society of now, it's resurgent, it has about 3,300. Why would they concern themselves with global resilience? The bottom line is, it's not their behavior that is creating the existential threat for them, okay? Unless there is a global change toward transformative resilience, they are not going to survive. And unfortunately, there may be people in this room that will not survive a full lifetime. So one of the interesting things is that the Commonwealth of Nations has chosen the Kalinago as one of 3 examples of the best regenerative societies in the world. So out of tragedy, and they have had lots of tragedy, there is a type of resurgence that happens that I'm hoping we can go through the tragedy in simulation in Tampa Bay area so that we don't have to actually face it without preparation and without the capacities and resources we need to recover effectively. So in terms of a definition of resilience, I want to, thank you, I want to have you contemplate the ability to withstand shocks and rebound quickly. What does that mean when you've got 400,000 houses damaged? In some senses, this assumption, the assumptions that underlie this definition of resilience is that you have a static state, that everything is sound generally, but you have a small hit. But now we know that the degradation of our ecosystems, our atmosphere, to be able to support life, is beginning to change. And that's true of our oceans as well. So we actually have to figure out, how do we create a definition of transformative resilience that not only allows us to adapt, but actually to transform the underlying conditions that are causing these circumstances. One of the concerns that I have, and I don't assume that this is the same for everybody in this room, but as I have watched the federal government go through 30, 40 years now of catastrophes, and I've made it my business to be in the response to the biggest disasters on the planet, I've noted a couple of things. One is we are really good at small-scale disasters. You know, we've got systems that probably are the best in the world for putting out fires and for having small police actions. But when Katrina hit, it became really obvious that our senior leadership really didn't know what was going on. And they were basically saying, oh, don't worry, it'll go back in the box. Everything's going to be fine. We'll make it better. We're going to build it back better. And luckily, that's been true enough for the majority in the Gulf Coast after Katrina. That would be considered a severity level 3. We very rarely hear politicians and the mainstream media actually saying that it's not going to go back in the box. And if it's not easy to get around that fact, like in Puerto Rico, they basically blame other politicians. So it gets swept under the rug what the real conditions are. We need to think about Tampa Bay region. What if we had a severity level 3, 4, 5 event? I just want to say that I'm not going to go into this in detail, but we're still only 10 years beyond the Deepwater Horizon event, which happened 7 years after British Petroleum rebranded themselves Beyond Petroleum. So there is a type of resilience washing that's going on, greenwashing, that is very persuasive, but it isn't true. And one thing that I think we have to consider is that adaptive resilience, don't worry, we'll build bigger walls. We have better science now that are going to address these issues. We'll fly planes and seed the clouds to change our atmosphere. And there's a lot that I think we have to be skeptical about. And I think we need to start really thinking about, can we set up a type of transformative resilience that is going to actually meet the requirements of the 21st century for Tampa Bay area? And if there's a time to do it, it's probably now. In Puerto Rico, when I did the assessment 4 months after Maria, we had already put millions of tons of material into Puerto Rico, and it was very chaotic. And we even had FEMA stealing some of the, actually confiscating, I wouldn't say stealing, confiscating the materials that were being brought in for humanitarian aid. It was a very chaotic, complex situation. But 4 months out, I was expecting that the food security issue, for example, I'm using that as one of the 26 mission critical functions to give you an example. I was expecting it to start to look better. So I went out to the FEMA headquarters and to the warehouses and to the NGOs and to the communities. And what I found was that the food security was going up. There were 600,000 people that didn't know where their next meal was coming from. And the president was threatening to pull the plug on the food security at that time, which was insane. And it would have, if you just evaluate it from a political point of view, it was insane. And I think better minds seemed to intervene. But when you add up the 400,000 to 500,000 people that had to leave the island, and the 600,000 people that didn't know where their next meal was coming from, there was 1 million people over the carrying capacity of Puerto Rico at that time. Okay? Can you imagine that there would be an event in the Tampa Bay area in which there would be 1 million people more that used to live here that can no longer live here the next day after some kind of event? Does anybody think that's improbable? So maybe it's time to actually consider, this was what it looked like 4 months out after the hurricane, when you look at the governor's residence in the distance and a wedding going on along the wall in Old San Juan. But all you had to do is walk 5-7 minutes away and you'd see buildings that were completely collapsed. And that was the good news. It was much worse in the mountains. So what if there was massive amounts of investment that would be seeking a home, that would be investment quality? Is Tampa Bay ready to actually take advantage of that? Well, there's a lot of things going on here. And in some senses, I think the picture is pretty clear of what needs to be done. But it hasn't been really brought together yet. And that's what we're proposing in the Tampa Bay Disaster Resilience Initiative through the serious games that would look at what the mission critical gaps are and look at what the solutions are that the stakeholders here want to engage. So one of the things that I think we need to think about, this is a difficult one, what would we do if we had 1 million climate migrants that no longer had homes here the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year? Where do they go? Is that our problem? Most of those people, but not all of them, I would say maybe 70%, might be in a situation where before they got hit, they really didn't have more than a month's worth of reserve. So we need to really think about, can we create communities of opportunity here that have social equity as a fundamental principle? What about the knowledge-based assets that we have in our universities and in our businesses? I think we've got tremendous assets that can be developed, but we're at the beginning of really putting that into a form that could become a sustainable political economy here. We have the opportunity for a shared economy. It's already started. We've got Airbnb, we've got Uber and Lyft, and so we have the basis for actually a political economy that could re-knit itself pretty rapidly on blue-green principles. There's a lot of money looking into how to address the problems after the crises, but there's also now money that's trying to figure out how do we actually create the upside. Now, communities of opportunity are places where money would seek opportunity. And I'm going to give you my bias. I think that the Tampa Bay area actually is perhaps one of the best places in the country to do this if we actually take action. And as I look at you, I'm trying to figure out, well, you guys are the leaders, are we going to take action? So I want to know from you. What are you willing to do? How do we become proactive? We've got a few tools and methods that we can throw into that game if you actually want to enter the game. So we're proposing that before the hurricane season, or at least the worst of the hurricane season, we do the first phase simulation that determines what the as-is conditions are. Not only what the gaps are, but what the solutions might be. And these are not gaps and solutions we're going to tell you about. They're gaps and solutions you're going to tell us and yourselves about. but we would help with the gathering of that information. And the idea is over the next 5 years to make sure that we actually have a 30-year window of what we have to really consider, so that the monies that are seeking a home as they divest from the petroleum political economy can find a place here, given that this was one of the most robust blue-green economies in the world at one point. Why don't we recreate that? Now, it may not look like it did 300 years ago, but some of the basic principles might actually be somewhat the same. So one thing that I'd like you to think about, I'm not going to go into all the reasons why I think this is a good bet for Tampa Bay, but I can say to you there's a lot of indicators that are showing that the money is moving. And when the Rockefellers confronted the oil companies and said, look, we think you're lying to the public, you're using the data yourself to harden your infrastructures, so we need you to come clean on this or we're divesting. And the oil companies got freaked out about it and looked at it economically, and they said, when they came back to have the discussion, they kind of just laughed at them and said, well, $6 billion isn't going to mean anything to us. But within a year, it was $200 to $300 billion, and now it's over $1 trillion, and it's headed to between 10 and $30 trillion over the next 10 to 30 years. It depends upon the kinds of actions that places like Tampa Bay will take to be proactive. So I'm going to go forward and just ask the question, so how will Tampa Bay residents become prepared and sustainable in what's coming? I think we know in general what's coming, but maybe we should know a lot more about what our gaps are down to the neighborhood level. So that is something that we could start the process of between now and when hurricane season really begins to crank up. We can also use that data to begin to build simulations that will test the community's ability to respond, get from them what they think the gaps are, and get from them what they feel the solutions are and what they're willing to do. So I'm really interested in what you guys think. It doesn't matter what I think, but it really matters what you think. Thank you very much.
Michael, you're a mind bender and a heart expander. We just have a couple of minutes. We expanded Michael's time because of what he needed to share with us. We were going to have some table conversations, but we only have about 5 minutes here. So I want to do 2 exercises. We're going to have a time to talk with Michael more along the way. The first exercise is to look at our 3 questions. What interested you the most? What surprised you? And what inspired you to take action? Just ask you to take a couple of minutes with your yellow Post-it note, briefly write down your response to those 3 questions so that we can get them posted up. As Michael said, we want to know what you think. So put your thoughts on paper for us so that we can capture that data. So just take a couple of moments now and go into that creative space that has been given to you, to each one of us, and capture your responses. Look around, folks. See who's living on the beach. You take a good look at these people. You might be needing to open your house to them. I'm not laughing. I hear you are, but make friends quickly. before you're hauled in front of the judge, a book I read says. Then, do you live in anybody live in South St. Pete here? Stand up if you live in South St. Pete. Yeah. You folks have a big job because a lot of people need to know this information in South St. Pete. That's one of the places we'd love to see a resiliency hub put. What if you live? What's that place called? North Shores or something like Shore Acres. What if you live in Shore Acres? Stand up if you live in Shore Acres. Yeah. You guys, I have a good friend who's a pastor at the church up there. I used to say, you pray for rain and then you can't go home until Monday because God grants your wish. Parking lot floods. What if you, how many live in that white circle in the middle of the island? Stand up if you live in that white circle in the middle of the island. You're now our best friends. Please give you our addresses. We are flocking to you. A tent city, that's great. She's one of the most generous people in the world. She really is, right? I have a dear friend who's a Methodist pastor in that highland up there. He tells me the neighborhood wants to put up a wall to keep the rest of us out. How many live in North Pinellas County? Stand up. We want to see. That's the way a sociogram works. So, bad news, you're not safe. Right? Who thought? What about across the bridge? How many are in Tampa? Stand up if you're in Tampa. It doesn't matter which bridge. If you're in the red area across the bridge, there you go. Is there anybody who's living in Temple Terrace here? Good, please give us your address. Yeah. You'll be safe because we won't be able to get there. Right? If you'll notice, all the bridges are out, right? So they're not just games, it's serious, right? Michael, we have a beautiful present for you. And it's a book that was put together by Dick Jacobs, who I believe you've met, on his photography around the world, his wanderlust to try and capture what's happening to our Mother Earth. So that's for our deep appreciation. Let's give Michael an expression of our love and appreciation. He's going to come back and be with us, and hopefully he'll be coming back again and again and help us think through the serious games that we need to be involved in. One thing I would like to just underline in what Michael said, he installed and commissioned you to be the leaders of the serious games. Did you hear that? I heard that. So Jacqueline will be taking your rank and serial number before you leave so we can make this happen.